All right, some more civics here, and this one's probably going to be more vocabulary driven, maybe, because the civics question that's worth asking today is what is judicial review? This is kind of in keeping with the last video where we talked about the purposes of courts in a republic, and I do talk about judicial review quite a bit. It's part of teaching civics in the classroom because it's about understanding, the power of the government, individual rights, responsibility of citizens, and all those rules that go along with self-government. So today's question is, what is judicial review? Well, judicial review is the power of the courts to decide whether a law or a government action or a public official's decision violates the Constitution. In effect, they can determine whether something is constitutional or unconstitutional. So if a court finds something that's unconstitutional, it can strike it down or it can prevent it from being enforced. And that's really just a major power, because it means that the Constitution just isn't this statement of ideals. It's not just, like an old historical document or a list of suggestions. It's really about the higher law, the supremacy of the Constitution. And so when ordinary laws of government, especially the actions, all those things happen to conflict with the Constitution is supposed to win. Supremacy Clause, Article 6. The most famous case that brings this to light with judicial review is Marbury v. Madison, which took place in 1803. And so the background here is largely political. You got President John Adams, who had lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, and before leaving office, Adams and the Federalists, the political party he belonged to, appointed several judges and a variety of officials. One of those appointments went to this guy named William Marbury. And before Jefferson takes office, his Secretary of State was James Madison. And he didn't want to deliver Marbury's commission, actually, putting him into, I believe it was a postmaster's position. So Marbury sues. And he wanted the Supreme Court to order Madison to deliver the commission, in effect giving him the job. But Chief Justice John Marshall really faced a difficult situation. If the court ordered Madison to act, and the Jefferson administration ignored the order, the Supreme Court would look weak. But if the court simply backed down, it would also look weak. So Marshall's opinion found a third path. So the Supreme Court said Marbury had a right to the commission. But part of the law that gave the Supreme Court the power to issue that specific order was unconstitutional. So the court ruled against Marbury, but in doing so, it ruled or announced something much larger. And what they announced was the role of the judiciary. The judiciary has the ability to say what the law is. And that principle became the foundation for judicial review. And judicial review matters because it gives courts a way to check the powers of the other branches of government. So Congress can pass law, and presidents in the executive branch can enforce laws. States can pass and enforce their own laws. But if those actions violate the Constitution, the courts can step in. That doesn't mean courts are more important than the other branches, though. It means the courts have a specific constitutional rule because they interpret law. They decide cases, and they help enforce constitutional limits. So without judicial review, constitutional rights would depend much more heavily on the same officials who might be violating them, and that would be a real problem. So if Congress passed a law restricting speech, who would decide whether that violated the First Amendment? If a state denied equal protection, who would decide whether that violated the 14th Amendment? If the executive branch claimed a power not granted by law, who would decide whether that had gone too far? So judicial review gives courts a role in answering those kinds of questions. And American history really shows why this matters. When we get to the 1950s and Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, the Supreme Court used constitutional reasoning to reject racial segregation in public schools. There's another case, Youngstown Steel or Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer. And the Supreme Court limited President Truman's attempt to seize steel mills during the Korean War. In United States v. Nixon, the court rejected President Nixon's claim that executive privilege allowed him to withhold evidence from a criminal investigation. Now, these cases all had their own differences, but they shared the same basic idea. and that is government has limits. And courts can be one place where those limits are actually put into place or enforced. But judicial review also raises some difficult questions. Courts are not elected in the same way Congress or the presidents are. And so federal judges serve during what's called good behavior, which usually means they serve for life unless they resign, they retire, or they're removed through the impeachment process, where they get accused of a crime and could be convicted. So when courts strike down laws passed by elected representatives, some people ask whether unelected judges really have too much power. And that's really a fair question when it comes to civics, because judicial review can protect rights and limit abuse. But it can also be controversial because judges are also human beings, and because they can disagree and make mistakes, and they can interpret the Constitution differently. And history shows that courts have sometimes protected liberty, and other times the courts have failed pretty badly. And that's why judicial review should not be treated as like this magical power. It's really not a guarantee that courts will always get the answer right, but it is a constitutional tool. And like any tool, it really depends on judgment, reasoning, independence, restraint, and public respect for the rule of law. So judicial review, the vocabulary term for today, really matters because a republic needs more than majority rule. It needs constitutional limits. So it needs it really needs rights that can't be simply erased because they're unpopular. It also needs a process for challenging government when officials go beyond their authority. And so we also then need a way to say that elected leaders are still bound by law. So the question was, what is judicial review? It is the power of the courts to decide whether government action violates the Constitution. I know my students would be saying, "Come on, Mr. Askin, put the fries in the bag. Let's get this thing over with. You've drifted, too long on this one." But the real civics question here is not whether courts should be able to overrule every political decision they dislike, because they shouldn't. The real question is whether constitutional limits mean anything if there's no institution that can enforce them. And that's why judicial review matters. So I hope that clears it up. I feel like I've made lots of videos about judicial review over this time. I've been creating videos and stuff like that. And I know I talk about it a ton in the classroom too. So a lot of this stuff seems to be kind of like, is it all blending together? Am I forgetting something? Am I getting it all out? But anyway, thanks to you, like 2%ers, 3%ers, 4%ers, whoever happens to hang around for these videos to the end. Really appreciate it again, and we'll make another one. This was 26, 27. Yeah, I don't know what I'm going to write about yet. It's kind of late tonight. But anyway, thanks for watching.